open this up to questions. Sir.
What year do we see the first digital MP in the UK? What year do we see the first corporate or class action lawsuit or equivalent for people feeling marginalised, threatened by the fact that a lot of their own rights have been maybe marginalised or not considered, linked to use of AI in the workplace? And then the last one, what year do you think we're going to see a national rollout of universal basic income of a country that is highly developed? Thank you.
I'm going to punt the UBI question to Keith and then go from there.
Yeah, okay. So, look, I think, and you know, one of the reasons we picked the panel we've got right is because we don't necessarily all agree on everything. That's super healthy, and so I think like the horses example that Lydia gave is a really good example and might be right. But one argument is that we are the horses in that story, right? Like and there are a lot fewer horses now in the US than there were then, and because what horses did was move people around. Now cars move people around. What we do is cognition. What these machines do is cognition. Now, as I've said before, we have an awful lot of facts about the human brain. We don't really understand how it works, so we are inferring. And so I think like, and the reason that really matters is because it answers. It affects this prediction directly, right? So if you take my line that, well, when we get to AGI and ASI, the role of humans in that system is going to reduce significantly. Therefore, naturally, it would follow that you would need a universal basic income, but actually you'd need to introduce it earlier than sort of the 2032 plus 4. So I would suggest you're looking at around 2030. But of course, if Lydia's right, and it's a perfectly respectable and possibly correct position, Al's got a really nice Jeff Hinton radiologist example on this that counters my kind of point. But you know, the argument Lydia made is right, which it might well be, then we'll never have a universal basic income because we won't need it, because our economy will just be more dynamic with people doing jobs that we can't envisage right now. So I'm going to say 2030 if my forecast is right, and never if it's not.
Well, I didn't say that we would never have UBI, but I'll give an example. So the other day, somebody asked me, you know, the new glasses by Facebook, that you can interact with them and all of that. And he said, well, how can you combine books with that? And I said, well, right now there's a technology called BookBot Live, and you can create a book that you can interact with. So if you have a book that you love, you can, like Harry Potter, for example, you would be able to interact with Harry Potter and say, you know, how many times does Harry Potter talk to Voldemort? And like, when did Harry Potter first have a kiss? And like, you can ask all these questions to the book. And so I told him with that technology and those glasses, what you could do is you could create an environment where you could be walking around, and we used Paris as an example in this case, you could be walking around Paris and you could be interacting with books and saying, like, where did Renoir paint X? And it's like, take me there. Like, okay, go straight this way and that way. And it's a whole new way to experience a city. But more than that, people can create new stories that would be fed into this model, into this system. So there's things that we can't exactly imagine today, but I do see a lot of new things that come out of the new technologies. Okay, so back to being the human crystal ball. We've got first digital MP. I mean, maybe late 2030s? And first lawsuit for people feeling marginalized, that's very difficult because you could say that already happened.
Yep. Copyright in the United States right now with a lot of music industries. There's already going on right now with the lawsuits against OpenAI and others for using copyrighted material. And so that's happening now, yeah.
But there's a case to be made about UBI in terms of it's basic income. So it doesn't mean that you don't need a job, but it's something that you can buy food with. So I think that's kind of the more plausible first option.
I'll have a go at the MP, I think. So it would depend what you would mean, because you probably wouldn't want to create a consciousness in a machine that tried to just be the same as another MP.
Yeah.
You
right.
would, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you would also then start thinking, well, is that how you would want to arrange a democracy as well? Because if you're talking about something that isn't limited in the number of interactions it can have in any given day to how many interviews it can have in a surgery while still coping with the party whips and still putting in its expenses claims and doing all the other things that we don't particularly like them for, you would end up having a system that looked a lot less like representative democracy and a lot more like participative democracy, because it would be able to constantly engage with its own constituents. But that would also predispose that the parliamentary system would want to do that. Because you have to also reconcile some of the sort of idiosyncrasies of the system that we have with MPs, which is most of us don't know our MP, most of us vote for a party. Most of us don't even vote for a party, most of us, I say most of the population, vote for the leader, and then there's a hint of the popularity contest about it. So are we likely to see a restructuring of Parliament driven by technology rather than other social or power-based imperatives? I think is probably going to be the thing that determines how long Parliament exists in that form. And I genuinely think that's probably driven more by some sort of impending crisis of confidence in the current system than it might be in the technological creation of a really good chatbot.
So I'm actually going to weigh in with Chair's prerogative here, because in a previous life I was a professor of political theory. So I love thinking about participatory democracy. And so if you think about automating participatory democracy, be it parliamentary systems or presidential systems like the United States, right? They're premised on the fact that you elect representatives because you're too busy to do it yourself, right? So I can't be in Washington going to all of these meetings, so I'm going to elect somebody, or I can't be in London, I'm going to elect somebody to represent my interests and be there, that's their job. But if you automate that representation, there's something quite odd about that, right? It's one thing to have a chat bot where you might have a chat bot where you can interrogate what are the policies that you have with regards to this, explain to me what you think the road should be here. That might just be an information gathering tool that would be quite helpful. I can see that. But automating the representativeness of a system seems really bizarre, because that's a delegation of authority that I'm not quite certain you want to do. We've already delegated to another person to represent our interests, and we can query them and we can recall them when they don't do so. You can vote them out. I don't know what voting out of a digital MP would look like. Just delete, right? So I feel like in that respect, the notion of delegation and authorization becomes really, really important. And that's a really misunderstood and often overlooked part of the discussion around artificial intelligence and autonomous systems that rely on AI. Because authorization is I have an authorization, a permission, or a right, and I am delegating that to another person or to another entity, and they are my proxy, right? I've delegated my authorization to them. If I'm delegating this to a non-human agent or a non-human entity, we do this all the time, right? Corporate moral agency, corporate legal agency, but we kind of still rely on the people that are around in those entities, even though they're non-human. But if I'm doing that to an artificial intelligence and I'm delegating that AI certain responsibilities, certain authorizations, you have to be very cognizant of what it is you're delegating to that system. And we tend to not be so cognizant of those delegations. So I would kind of caution about the digital MP, because I don't know if we want to delegate that just yet. At least I don't. Well, maybe I do, because Washington is full of...
Can we go on that for another second longer? So the other power dynamics to take account of is the international power dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So say Singapore, which is consistently kind of, I mean, how democratic it is on, there are various indexes that argue not very, but that's a different matter. Like, they have pioneered all kinds of innovations, and have really tried to push the digital economy. So if you're going to have a digital minister, probably it's going to be there first. And if that means that what you see in the kind of equivalent of my last slide of the global rankings is Singapore racing up it, I think you'll see electorates going, well, hang on a minute, we want more of those guys. You know, we want some of these digital MPs that are actually helping our country to grow faster, to be more prosperous, to be more successful. So, I mean, there's a whole load of ifs in what I've just said. But I think there are other power dynamics that could drive that change to happen much more quickly. And it's the international power dynamic as opposed to just the local one.
Are there any other questions?
My name is Frey, from Ray and AI, a new company. So, you know, some of you talked about rights and history, and they're repeating history. and quickly bring you back to the witches, which we burnt for satanic practices. Frequently, these were healers, midwives, and their fault was to have usually something written in Latin, and what was written in Latin was the Lord's Prayer. And I think this is relevant if you think to what we did to them, and then in the information, when the information came, how we tried to block that, how we tried to block the printing, how we try again and again. And when I saw, for instance, what we were doing as soon as this GPT came out, is that many of the leaders of corporate America wanted to essentially block it, regulate it. I don't know if that was the main cause or whether it was to own it. It's a question, really. Because here is the thing. We've translated to some decency about 100 languages of the 7,000 languages in the world. Now, I happen to speak natively one of those languages, Icelandic, which has about 300,000 population. I've recently been working with a sub-Saharan African language, which has over 3 million speakers and has not been translated. There are 1 billion of humanity online. There are about 8 billion who are not. Now, these are serious ethical issues, very serious ethical issues, and very pertinent to our security, our defense and security, because our troops, when deployed, are deployed into areas that are largely offline, largely not in the Google database. I mean, big cities and villages have never seen the Google car. They are not in OpenStreetMap. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have now a technology at our fingertips that can really, really, really switch this around. If we use it for benign purposes, if we look really thoroughly, come together, the privileged lot of us that is here, come together and put our minds to how can we use this technology to reach humanity, to start to reduce the bias of the learning simply by taking in more of human knowledge, by simply having larger corpus to learn from. Is that what we need? And in regulation, don't we have the regulation? Isn't it more about enforcement? Perhaps what we need is to start to train more of these engines in more countries, distributed around the world, and give a public ownership of it, a public access of it, a freedom of right, like we have online now access. So that's the thought.
Okay, we'll put a pin in that for a second. And then someone else had their hand up at the same, just sir, behind you.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the thoughts about mixing technologies. So sort of like AGI, ASI, but actually when you combine that with sort of, the Meta glasses or even probably worse, Neuralink, how do we deal with what inequalities that might generate? Because suddenly you're going to have effectively a few superhumans and everybody else.
Yeah. In fact, your two questions build off of each other quite nicely.
Yes.
And let's go to Nick, and then we'll maybe have a chance of discussing the global have and have-nots and inequalities and superhumans, and some states want them.
Thank you, Nick Colosimo, BAE Systems. So, dead easy question. We all want to head in the right direction. What are your 3 key performance indicators that we can use to make sure we are going in the right direction? Sorry, Heather knew it was coming.
Nick Colosimo, friend of the show.
Exactly. The mic drop. Okay. Well, I'm going to punt. So, you guys, what do you think about the global inequality question and really parlaying that into, we do have currently a system of global inequality and power relations, but how do we potentially equalize that to a greater or democratization of wealth and technology? Maybe that's the way to say it. I don't know. Redistribution.
I'm just going to assume that the question well, you said, how can companies come together to close the digital divide, basically? And so if we look at it from a corporate perspective, it needs to be something that has a financial incentive. And what I was trying to explain with the UN Sustainable Development Goals is that in pursuing them, there is a financial incentive after that. And just as companies invest millions into developing a new market or being a competitive leader, I think that companies can put money towards closing digital divides in areas that they care about, because the whole world would be very expensive. But picking an area and saying, we want to grow our market in X in Africa with these 3 million people that speak this language, like the example you gave, and say, where can our market growth be? What could we do? And then have a plan to say, great, we're going to invest this much money, just like any other business plan. We're going to grow this market. And growing that market also means closing the digital divide that those people in that market have, and then serving them. And then maybe I'll leave the 3 key performance indicators at the end, and then let them talk. Yeah.
So, but are you saying, just for clarification and for my own edification, are you saying then that that type of it's an FDI approach, right? So you're going to be looking
foreign direct investment. Yes.
Yeah.
But it's a financial kind of like business case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so because so there's this entrepreneur I like. He says that the problem that 1 billion people have is $1 billion worth of a market, or more, frankly. But basically that if you look out, you'll see many problems that you can solve and fix, and the digital divide is really one of them. The digital divide also means that they don't participate in the digital economy. Digital economy is the predominant economy. In the US, there are many parts of the rural US that do not have access to the internet, and so they don't have Amazon. They don't have any of the things that we use and don't participate in the digital economy. And so, but participating in the digital economy means that all the companies can start to offer things. So, and if you might say, oh, well, my company doesn't have enough money to do that, well, you can create a team and say, we're going to partner together for this foreign direct investment market growth opportunity. So, does that?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Anybody?
Yeah, so I'll have a couple of those. I don't know they're necessarily answers, but they're things you made me think of. So I'll go that way. And the 2 questions I think are related. So the first one is that the tendency in the language we use often hides a huge dependency on the creation of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So we often use terms in the industry like cloud as if somehow or other there's a floaty, ephemeral thing that's doing this, rather than just loads of servers on the end of a wire somewhere that's doing that. The probably positive story that stops us having to think about recreating every piece of infrastructure that exists in the essentially Western countries, for want of a better description, all across the world, is a case study from Kenya and Tanzania, which was the adoption of a new form of phone banking, which was, they worked out that just trading the credits associated with phone card charges was a really easy way to introduce digital currency. And it grew from the ground up. And there wasn't a requirement to go and create loads of branches and loads of other forms of wire and everything else. And it changed the path dependency to get to phone banking that didn't require all of the historical construction that you had in Western countries to get to that same point. So it might be that some of the investments we need to make in infrastructure are not an entire recreation of everything that's happened in the past 200 years in countries that were, got there early in the Industrial Revolution. The superhuman one, I think, is an interesting flip on that, and I'm not quite so worried about that. And there was I've forgotten the name of the guy. He was the person who coined the phrase the viral media, and he's a sci-fi writer, and he ended up getting paid to go and talk to a small group of billionaire and trillionaires who were getting together, and they were essentially trying to decide how to survive post the event, as they kept referring it to it. So there's obviously going to be some great catastrophe, and then they're going to build their, they weren't going to build a spaceship because they said that there's another tier of billionaires beyond them that can do that. They were going to have to be Earth-based because they didn't quite have enough money. And so their questions were things like, is it New Zealand or Alaska? Do we go there? And then they asked other questions like, okay, when currency is useless, how do we keep our security guards loyal? And he started with the point that, well, first of all these premises that you're going to build this escape bubble that so ejects you from the rest of humanity are actually relatively absurd because no one's going to let you get there. And second, all of the dependency you have on the people who support that are going to evaporate, and then you're going to be murdered by bigger security guards who quite like your jacuzzi. So, and the only way around it, he suggested, is frankly being nice to people. So the single best way of stopping people murdering you is if they like you. So there are genuinely altruistic and selfish reasons that can go hand in hand to the creating of the betterment of the society. Have we all gone, or I can't remember? Are we doing the threes now?
KPIs?
Well, I've got well, in academia we call it a two-finger point, which means I want to follow on. So one finger is new question, two finger is follow on. So I'm going to follow on. The idea, though, that we can find new ways of creating these kind of crossing the digital divide, creating new markets, creating new incentives for different types of patterns of behavior with the existing infrastructure in places that don't have it. That's great, but I'm going to disagree with my right honorable friend. And just basically say, look, yeah, that's wonderful in places that you don't really care about strategically. It's like, cool, give them whatever. But I work in national security, right? And one of my job functions is to put on what I call the evil genius hat, right? So I put on the evil genius hat and I think, what are the worst ways I could corrupt whatever this is? And then let me reverse engineer that because I think someone's thinking that way. So now how do I guard against all of those things that I've just thought are horrible things, right? Like, so, and I won't go into belabor the horrible things I must think of. But the idea here is, right, like if you don't, and this is a flippant way to say it, if you don't care about an area of the world because it's not strategically important to you from a national security perspective, then you don't really mind if they get certain types of technologies delivered to them or they create new markets and things like this. But if a strategic area of the world is important, you care very much what types of technologies go to them and who's providing them, right? So you can think about, for instance, you can think about the going out policies of China right now, right? You can think about the Belt and Road initiatives. You can think about all of these things and Xi Jinping's not only, oh yes, we'll invest in your country. We'll set up that infrastructure for you. It might fall apart in 5 years, but we won't talk about that. But we also are going to give you access to cellular data. We're going to give you access to data centers. We're going to give you the ability to do all of these great AI tools and things. But by the way, we're going to own all that data. We're going to suck all that data. And you don't really own the things that you think you own. And we're going to use your population's data to train everything that we want, right? And so strategically, this is a worry for not just companies, but for states, right? And for militaries and for individuals. So I think, yes, in some ways, it's like, yeah, it's great to come up with these new novel ways of doing business that don't rely on infrastructure, but we have to put that into context of major power players who are worried about the rise of other powers and the using of that creation of infrastructure as an incentive to do not so nice things. So I'm going to disagree. And then the KPI, I'm only going to give you one. So, a key performance indicator of are we doing the right thing? We're having the discussion. Right? We're not waiting until it's like, oh, it smacked you in the face. So, again, in a previous life, I wrote the DoD's AI ethics principles. So I'm the ghost author behind those principles. And the fact that the DoD wanted to have AI ethics principles and came to somebody like me, who I am known or renowned or infamous for not telling you what you want to hear. So, for me to say, okay, you want to do this, well, we're going to do it right. And I'm going to ask you hard questions that you may or may not want to answer. And so the fact that they said, yes, we like this and we're going to adopt it and we're going to move forward with it, and we're going to create institutions internally to try to actually put them into practice. And we're going to think about ways of grant writing and testing and evaluation and verification and validation in our testing regimes. And we're going to do all of these different things. Like that to me is a sign of, that's a KPI, right? That is, okay, we are making the effort. Is there more to go? Sure. But the fact that you guys are in this room, the fact that the UK is having an AI safety summit, that's a good KPI. So that's mine. Now it's up to you.
Well, look, some people have heard me say this before anyway. So I think as a country, we ought to be tracking the number of new to market inventions as a percentage of our GDP. I think what that forces you to do is then to track not just the number of things that you've invented, but they've got to scale to have a meaningful effect on how we change our business. For companies, I would say that that's new to market, new to firm inventions, and I think that's important because you'll be competing with your innovation ecosystem. Can you innovate faster than your rivals? And that is what we've adopted within the centre where both Al and I work. That is our KPI. So it's a lazy answer. I think two bigger picture things. I think you should be measuring cohesion in our human teams and indeed in our society. I think having metrics that track that are crucial. And then trying to understand the effect these technologies are going to have on it will be absolutely essential for building a sensible digital democracy. And then I think the other thing I'd want to track is the number of anticipatory policies we have. Like we used to have this thing called the War Book in the UK that Maurice Hankey first published when he was the first cabinet secretary, had all the plans for everything that might go wrong. And it doesn't exist because in the 1990s, the government of the day got rid of it because every time we leaked a plan for some like pandemic or other like disaster that might befall us, it was a bad news story. So well, we can't possibly talk about that because it will be leaked that we are planning for X. We need to bring that back. We need to bring it back fast, and we need to have a whole raft of policies that are off the shelf, ready to go. And I think that would be the sign of a society that's beginning to take the impact of this potential technological change, not potential, the impact this technological change is going to have seriously, rather than waiting for us to trip over a problem and then going, oh my God, how do we like respond to that? So they would be my three, Nick. But that was an extremely difficult question, so I'm glad I went last.
No, you just have to have COAs, right? Courses of action, right? You have a multitude of COAs, and that way, whatever comes forward, you can pick and choose and put them together and create new ones, right?
Well, for me, it's not a hard question because this is, in my consulting work, what I spend a lot of time with. So from an organizational perspective, the three key performance indicators to know that you're going in the right direction are: one, creating a new market that doesn't exist with a new supply chain and new types of talent, because that means that you would be market leaders in creating a whole new space. Two, setting up your organization process, workflow, and all assets to be digital twin ready. I don't think people appreciate how important digital twins are, and if we go back in time and say, you know, when we all got online and then we've got Microsoft Office and whatever else, that was a digital transformation. Well, the next big one is digital twins. So getting yourself set up for that. And then three, experimenting nonstop with what is happening at the edge of your market, because the edge becomes center.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the first sector or industry likely to be disrupted will be education. And I say that because I think that one of the things you should start measuring is how much you are taking advantage of that educational disruption, because that is going to be the thing that unlocks all of the innovation, the experimentation. But I think it's also important from a rights point of view, because your ability to understand the new world that you are navigating in and entering into is going to be one where you are constantly learning how to keep up with the technology, and you won't need to know everything all the time, because your ability to access information through those tools and the ability to use them will be really important. So how a state or an organization shapes that, promotes that, and chases after the success of that education and its disruption, I think will be number one. I think number two is probably a state issue, which is going to sound really boring, but it's going to be monopolies and cartels. Because the possibility of concentrating power and therefore hiding what happens behind a veil is going to be hugely driven by the ability to be the only player in a particular space. So if you have a multitude of potential suppliers and transparency starts to become a factor that is valued, so you know what happens to your data and how that firm is treating you, that will thrive and prosper, provided you're not in a monopoly environment. So I think that is going to be really important. And I think the last one is going to be back to infrastructure. So working out how you're enabling all of the systems that support and underpin that. And some of that, I think, goes back to arguments about water and how you are providing the infrastructure so that you can have environmentally sustainable versions of these systems, and the ability to invest in systems that are, you know, potentially a bit out there, but not unrealistic, is sort of neuromorphic computing, where we're thinking about really low energy new forms of chips and technology in order for that revolution to be sustainable into the future, rather than just die in some sort of horrible greenhouse.
I thought of one more KPI while you guys were talking. So I think it's the delta, right, between the education stuff, right? So who's getting educated and the pace at which you're in upskilling, reskilling, as well as, little people. I have a little person at home, right? And the types of things that they're learning and interacting with. And then the delta, the change rate between the people who are in power and so are they kind of static and stuck? So you're looking at the age of, I keep thinking of the United States, and I think some of the senators in my country, and I think, oh God, right? They're here and they don't understand what we're talking about because they haven't educated themselves, or they don't even, some of them have wall calendars, they don't even use iCal, right? So they have an aide to do all their emailing, right? So if they're in a digital desert mentally, and then all of the upskilling and reskilling is happening, and you have a huge delta between leadership and the masses, so to speak, you're not going to have that change rate that you want, right? So I think that would be a good KPI.
So I'm just going to take the opportunity to air a hate and arguably disagree with you a little bit in the sense that...
How dare you?
Yeah, so and it's just a trope I hear, which is, oh, we'll use the digital natives, we'll delegate to the kids. And when somebody says that, I hear, I can't be bothered to learn anymore. And it's this weird idea that somehow children are born with some sort of genetic technology chip that means they can learn this now. And yet you grew up in this world where all of this technology came from, and you have more time and have had more experience.
And that is a fantastic place to end, because all of you can now go out and learn more. So thank you so much for your attention. And let's give our speakers a round of applause.